The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, let's try that again with the mute button off. Good morning, everybody. My name is Emma. I'm here from Exago to present what is this, the fourth iteration in our Train the Trainer lab, third or fourth here. We're going to be talking about advanced reports today. I'm super excited. I think advanced reports of the entire application are my favorite part. Um, Before I really jump in, if you guys could just type a Y or a yes, just like usual, into the questions pane and let me know that I'm coming through loud and clear, that would be great. And of course, that you can see my screen okay. You should be able to see Exago Support Lab, Train the Trainer, Advanced Reports on there. There they come. Okay, great. All right, so just once again, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up today. We really appreciate all of you. Now, let's dive right in. So today we're going to talk about advanced reports. And if you haven't made any of our previous Train the Trainer labs, I'll give a little bit of a recap on the point here, what we're really shooting for. These labs are meant to break the fourth wall and really try to give the trainers at our client sites an understanding of the thought process that we go through over here at Exago before we enter a training with either you folks or your clients, before we put content out that is meant for both user groups there, and really enable you guys to be able to put together trainings that you feel confident in, that really get the point across, and that enable all of your users to consume Exago in a successful way, and hopefully a way that makes them feel good about it, right? The idea is that it's not so scary that we don't want to ever come back. We like it and we get what we need out of it, and we come back time and time again to continue reporting and getting those data insights. All right, so for today, I'm going to stick with my flipping between the slides and Exago style of lab. I think the first two slides that I've got here will be one set, and then I'll come back for some updates. As always, if you'd like to ask any questions, feel free to type them into the questions pane. I don't have anyone behind the scenes today. It is just me. So bear with me if I take a moment to get to your questions, but I will either answer them live if they're appropriate for the entire audience, or just answer you directly in the chat, potentially follow up afterwards if it's a little bit more of a targeted question. All right, that's enough housekeeping. Let's get to it. So the topics for today. Now, this is a high-level overview. I'll go into each of these, but really we find that if you've begun your training with ExpressView, mimicking that data structure in advanced reports can help users to understand the difference in the process that they will take to build that same report, and some other details that are very important there. So that's going to be our first point. Always start in the wizard. Now, there's no other way to start an advanced report other than converting from an express view. But what I really mean by this is don't open an advanced report that you've already created and start there. Teach them from scratch. How did we get to this point? What is the setup info behind the scenes? And why is it important? And that's really the main idea here. The third bullet says change, run, change, run. So for a little clarity, what I mean is work iteratively, make very small changes in the designer and execute them to show the difference. We want to be able to give users the understanding of what each change we're making does and what cements that idea better than running the report and showing them the output. I think the fourth bullet is the most important here. So if you ignore me for the rest of it, listen to that one, please. What to highlight in the designer? There is so much in the Exago Advanced Report Designer that you could talk about. There's so much that if you're anything like me, you probably want to talk about. But there's a few key pieces that we found time and time again. Again, we aggregated this entire lab series from years working with you guys and feedback from a few of you that I've actually chased down. There are a few very important areas of the designer that you're going to want to talk about with your users on their first time in there. the last thing is build something of value. And this is a carryover from the ExpressView lab as well. One more thing I just want to say, we've gotten just a little bit of feedback on some of the other Train the Trainer labs that they don't cover the entire designer, and that it would be very helpful if we were to sort of exhaust anything and everything that users might want to do in the designer and how to talk about them as a trainer. I just wanted to address why that's not the point of these labs. First and foremost, they're supposed to be short and succinct. We really want to make sure that they don't interrupt your entire morning, take all of your day, and derail all the rest of the work that you have to do. The other thing is that Exago is, we over here like to liken it to a Swiss Army knife. There are so many tools that you might pull out, but walking through each and every single one of them means that the bulk of the content is probably not applicable to most of the viewers, and maybe there's one or two highlight areas that actually apply to your use cases. So what we've done with this series is an attempt to, at a very high level, just give you the intros, the stuff that everyone's going to hit, the pieces that in order to use a designer you need to understand, and then talk about how we deliver them. So I just hope that that helps to give everyone an understanding of the purpose here, and really why we've structured them as we are. We take your feedback very seriously. This entire series was born of feedback and suggestions and observing folks. So I really hope that that comes through with the content that we deliver. All right. So I don't like to spend too much time in the slides. Mimicking ExpressView is pretty straightforward. I think the biggest bullet is that third one. We want to remove the focus on the data. We know that a lot of end users might have the biggest hurdle for them might be understanding data structure and what it looks like behind the scenes, and sort of abstracting that away is the purpose of a reporting tool, to make it accessible to end users. So by using a data structure and relationships that you've just discussed in ExpressView, we can allow users to really focus on the designer at hand and understand how to use it functionally without focusing on, oh man, I don't remember what data fields I'm using and how these relate, and I don't even know what I might group by because I don't understand. We can kind of take that bit out of it. Now, consistency is key, especially when learning different tools. And then again, keep it simple. One of the things we said from ExpressView was pick 2 or 3 data objects that your users are familiar with, and stick with those for at least your initial report. So that's the same idea here. Start in the wizard, again, might seem kind of obvious, but it is important in our findings to go slow, explain the setup process. Again, keep it simple. Really focus on sorts. Even if your users do understand things like, hey, sorts are used to order the data, focusing on why in Exago's designer specifically, because it is different than other tools on the market. Why is that important? And a lot of you, I'm sure, are, because grouping. So we're going to get to that. And I promise I'm going to walk through this bit. The last piece here is use the layout tab. For a long time, I actually did trainings without the layout tab. And I think that for a certain user group, it is appropriate to skip it. But for a less technical group, I think starting with the layout tab is very critical. So I'm going to go into that now. Let's hop over to Exago. Okay, great. So home screen, we're going to work right in my local copy today. And I'm going to start from scratch. So we're going to create an advanced report. We're going to create something that is very straightforward. Today, I will do orders per employee. Keep it narrowed to a couple data objects, just like we mentioned. Save it in a folder. Explain what you're doing here, right? I'm giving the report a name. I'm saving it in a report folder that I have access to, right? Maybe this one is locked in your version. We can add a description if you'd like. You don't have to. Just, point out what we're looking at. But this tab in particular is pretty straightforward. Now, again, if you've just taught ExpressView, you probably gave them an understanding of the data structure. Tie back to what they already know. hey, we just talked about this. These are the objects that we have available, or categories, whatever verbiage you've chosen, stick with it, be consistent. I don't care what you call them. Maybe there are certain words that make a lot more sense to your users because of the space you're in. Part of the nature of these labs is that we need to kind of generalize because our clients are in all sorts of industries and spaces. So whatever you stick with, whatever you choose, just stick to it. Now, I'm going to drag over information. You will likely highlight the graying out of data objects here if it's something that you are using in your implementation. And we don't need to get super technical. We can just explain that, hey, there's no relationship directly between employees and order details. So if I'd like to get to order details, I need to use this orders object, which is black. I am still allowed to click it. And now, hey, look at that, order details becomes accessible to me. I didn't go super deep. I didn't talk about joins or the fact that my administrator set them up or anything like that. This is what you need to know. If it's gray, you can't use it. The reason is there's no relationship. All right. Now, I mentioned before that the sorts tab is one of the most important. Now, I like to start by, giving a quick overview. We know that we sort by given data fields to order my data. So if I'm creating a report about employees, I'd like to first sort by employee information. But the other reason that I'm going to need to create sorts here is any amount of grouping that I'd like to create. Now, again, tie it back to what they know. Remember in ExpressView, we just grouped by given fields, and that allowed us to summarize per those fields, things like this. Maybe on this report, I'd also like to group by order ID. I don't really care if the report is ordered by the order IDs. I don't care if they're ascending, descending, or completely random, but I do need to create a grouping on it. So what I'm going to do right now is create a sort on it. And bear in mind, we're planting a seed here. We're not bringing this full circle right away, but we will come back to why that's important. Now, filters are something I usually skip at the wizard portion of creating a report. But if your data structure lends to it, and this is something, maybe reports are always going to be filtered right off the bat, maybe this is something that you do highlight right at the beginning and just explain why we might use a filter. I'm actually going to loop back to the filters in a little bit because I think that there's an important distinction to make regarding filters in the Advanced Report Designer. So I'll come back to this one. Finally, the layout tab. So just like I said, for some user groups that are more technical, going right to the grid can be helpful. If the report that we are creating is very unstructured and not really detail row oriented, the layout tab's probably not very helpful. But for something that is more typical of a report, or just users that don't even really know what they're trying to create, the layout tab is definitely a good place to start. So very simply, I'm going to add here anything that I might want to see on my report. I want to see last name. I drag the last name field over, point out that I can switch objects and that these are exactly what we added in the beginning. So at this point, I'd like to go to the orders table. I'm going to grab order ID and I'll grab order date. I'd like to see both of those columns of information. And of course, order details, I'm going to go just a bit deeper and I'd like to see the revenue, the quantity, and maybe the unit price of each. Okay, great. So I've got a little preview down below. I'm using different verbiage for all of these. Again, I'm just sort of throwing out some example phrases that you might use, but you guys should do well to stay consistent. That'll really help out. I'm not going to summarize by anything here. The only reason I'm even using the layout tab is to give a detail report right off the bat. So, okay, great. We can go ahead and press finish. And now we're brought to my designer. Now, one of the biggest things that I like to say is don't make any changes to the designer until you've executed the report and explained why we see what we see. So I'm just going to quickly go back to the slides We're going to talk about the next 2 slides. So let's just hop through the next 2 here. Hey, great question. So we just had a question that came in. Is it good to use grouping at the layout tab? And I think that this one is different based on the user group in my experience. But typically my answer would be no, and I'll explain a little bit. If my user group is advanced enough to go straight to grouping, I'll do it all in the designer, because I think that that is the best place to show sections and grouping with a good understanding of why we're doing it and what the result is. If my user group is non-technical enough to require the layout tab, I want to show them a very blank, a very simple detail report first, and what I mean by that is one with no grouping, something that is a data dump in essence. So I rarely use grouping at the layout tab in training, because I think that those 2 user groups are distinct enough where that kind of falls right in the middle. Certainly, if your users are right in the middle and you think that that's a great place to start, feel free. I mean, it's there and it's helpful. But in my experience training, it's not been the best route for any of the major groups. Okay, so you're in the designer. Now what? Run it simple first, and this is what I just said. Don't make any changes, just run it and give them a look at what they've got. Now, from there, make simple changes and execute in between each change. So iterative successes, and this is a main idea that we tie back to from the Express view. We've got very small changes, but each one is a success. We're almost setting goals for ourselves just 5 yards ahead instead of 100 yards down the field. And each of them is a success. I'd like to do X, small change, break everything down into very small steps and run it in between to show that change. This last one is actually something that we use internally. I can remember coming aboard years and years ago and being taught to use the Advanced Report Designer with colors denoting sections. So it's a bit of a nostalgia thing for us, but it really is a great learning tool. If folks are really having trouble with understanding sections and headers and footers particularly, use colors, color code the background and execute it and show the difference, because having to look closely enough to see the varying data values is a little bit harder when you don't really understand what you're looking at. I'm going to go into a few of these in the designer, but I just want to talk about this slide first. In the designer, and I mentioned this just before, but there's so much that you might highlight, right? And let's go back again to that Swiss Army knife analogy. There are so many things that I might want to use. And even within a single implementation, maybe you gave them the whole Advanced Report Designer. There are so many things that they might want to do. But by starting with a simple use case that touches on some of the big ones, and I'm going to tell you today the ones that we feel are the big ones that you'll want to start with, you can give them the tools. And then my last slide, let questions drive the session. So if there are more things that they'd like to do that you've not touched on, maybe the format cells menu, that's not one of my first bullets here. Maybe a question comes up, hey, I want to add a $sign. How do I do that? You don't waste time, you eliminate extra information, and you convey value by letting them ask the questions that you're able to respond with good content for. Now, those things that we do feel are important to highlight: how to get back to the wizard menus, right? How to add data objects to my report, or change filters, change sorts. Those are, I mean, fundamental. You really won't get very far in the designer if you're struggling to get back to those. Clicking on row numbers and column headers. We've had plenty of feedback that the row number menu is something that folks, dug for a long time before finding. I feel that as a trainer, I can enable people to be more capable in the Advanced Report Designer and not get frustrated when they're attempting to create reports by just pointing it out right off the bat. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. It's very important. Go ahead and point them back there. And then filter options and the differences. One of the biggest things I see, again, often is why are there two filter menus? Explain the difference. And you don't need to do this technically. You don't need to say, hey, this is database filters and these are interactive in-memory filters. We don't need to go that deep. Just explain how the interaction changes and what implications it has on their reporting. So now that we've talked about most of this, let's just go back and really quickly explain what I mean using that report. So first things first, I would run this report. And great, we've got 29 pages of data. That's awesome. But this doesn't really teach me very much, right? So the first thing I would point out is likely all of these repeat values. And recall that we created a sort on that field, which means that we can create a grouping. Great. How might we do that? So one of the first fundamentals here is creating groupings, and we're going to link right back to the sorts because we did mention this earlier, but by clicking on this section, we can add a section. I know you guys know this. This is sort of the way I might walk through it. Now, I like to explain all of the sections here the first time that I enter this menu. I'm not going to walk through it right now because, again, you guys all know them. But I do think it's important to just explain, even if you leave off repeating groups, explain when you would use page headers versus report headers, what group headers and footers are and how they differ. I'm going to go ahead and add a group header on that last name field. Great. So at this point, you can very clearly tie back to those sorts. Hey, we added these sorts. Now you're seeing it here. Planting the seed earlier means that it's probably going to convey to people easily. All right, great. Oh, one more question. So how do you best explain repeating groups? So first and foremost, I don't explain repeating groups unless the data lends itself to it. If the users don't have a use case for it, it's extraneous information. And if they don't have data set up to structure repeating groups, they're going to have a hard time conceptualizing why they would ever use that and when they become helpful. That being said, the best way to explain repeating groups is using an example, in my opinion. So we have the AdventureWorks database internally. So when we all come aboard and onboard new folks here, we'll use that. Okay, one teacher has multiple students. That same teacher also has multiple advisees. I'd like to show for each teacher those disjoint sets of data, right? Students do not need to be advisees of the same teacher, and advisees do not need to be students of the same teacher, but I want to show both those groups. So I think to summarize, explain them using an example. Put it in their terms, right? All right, so let's throw that group header on. Now, we've got this new section, awesome. The only restructuring I'll do before I actually execute this report is to throw another row in, move those column headers down. I'll explain why I'm doing all of this as I'm doing it. And then you can use this to show the merge cell button and just put the last name right up here. Now, actually, let me change that just slightly so we can delete column A, right? And then delete column 3. Now, I'm going really quickly right now. I totally recognize that. But you would talk through this as you go and explain why you're doing everything, what you're doing. Again, don't change too much before running the report. Now, take a moment on the output, right? Okay, we've just changed some stuff. We've changed some structure, but this report is now extremely readable. We have, for each employee, that set of detail information. We're showing the exact same set of data as before, but instead of having the employee last name in a column repeating next to all of the associated data fields, we put it in a header and then show all of the associated data below. And we can page over to the next iteration of a group header to show how that's changed. All right. Now, the next thing that I'd like to do is add another group header. And at this point, I am going to start using that color coding because once we've hit 2 levels of nested grouping, it's very helpful to color code things and make it a little bit more clear. So I'm going to make the same changes as before. I'm going to insert another row. I'm going to move down these column headers. I'm going to delete that previous row, and I'm going to go ahead and add the order IDs. Now maybe I indent this a little bit just to give it a bit of structure. Increase the size there. We can even move these over, right? So the structure at this point is really up to you guys. However you'd like to do it here is totally up to you. I like to keep my report simple, so I tend to bring everything in as much as possible when I'm initially showing it. Now I'm going to go ahead and color code these. So just simple pastel backgrounds can help, right? I'll use a very light red, make this just a little bigger, and we can make it, gosh, a light green, whatever, Christmas. And then if we want, we can add footers, right? So this is really where we hammer home grouping and that nested relationship. So I'll add an order ID footer. We can do some simple summaries, and unless teaching formulas is the point, you can throw them in. If teaching the formula editor is something you'd really like to focus on, explain what you're doing. Great, I'm gonna go ahead and aggregate the revenue. So all I need to do is start typing, ag sum, and we want the revenue field, so we type, easy peasy. Aggregates are really the simplest formulas to teach. Now, here's the kicker. Once I add that second group footer on employee last name, and we'll bump it down so that they wrap the way you might expect, like a sandwich, I can hold Control and copy that formula right down. You can go into the context-sensitive nature of sections at this point. So we've just created a very simple report and managed to touch on some really key concepts here. We touched on sections and how to add them, what the different sections do and where you would use them. We touched on formula writing. We touched on related sections, so how headers and footers can tie together but don't need to. And now we're about to visualize that on the report. So I broke one of my own rules here. I did more than one change before executing the report. But I just, you guys aren't the ones that we're trying to train. So I just want to make sure that we make the most of your Wednesday morning and move a little bit quicker here. So now at this point, when I do run this report, we're going to very clearly see the header and the footer of each section. And if we add some space, if we added a white space in between this, it would be even more abundantly clear that this was the footer and this was the header of that order ID section. We can go over to Callahan and see the next iteration. It'll be a couple pages now because we've got all this space. And now we can see the footer, again, that revenue aggregate value that we just added in there. All right, so from here, you might go into charts, you might go into more complex formulas or maybe more formatting options. This is where the labs really lose some punch if we go into the deep details here. But if you guys do have any specific things you'd like to see, please feel free to let me know. And right on cue, that's a great question. We can definitely look at formatting options. So this is one of the questions that I usually get next, and it leads me to the format cells menu. So B8 is, I'm sorry, the question was, can we take a look at the formatting of B8? So the idea here, and this question generally comes up a lot, it doesn't really look like a monetary value and we're summing the revenue field, right? So by selecting the cell, I can teach them the Format Cells menu. You're going to go head up to your toolbar, click this Format Cells menu, and this allows me to assign a very specific formatting to the output of that particular cell. So what I can do here is use the number option, and this will format that output as a number, that value as a number. I can use my currency symbol. I've got 2 decimal places applied and a thousandth separator if my numbers go that high. And I can really use that to illustrate the difference here. So now that I've made those changes, I can run my report again and I can show them that, I think it was 3 or 4 pages over, that now this value looks monetary. That's a very key skill in the advanced report designer. So I think that question was very appropriately timed. Okay, great. This is a good question as well. So I just want to clarify that the number formatting here, so let's actually use this one. The number formatting is not applied unless we click the number to apply it. So even though these are default settings that are filled out here, if I still have this on general, they're not going to be applied. If I have this on date, whatever date selection will be applied, things like that. But just because these are here by default, doesn't mean that they're going to be applied if general is still the category that's selected for that cell. So bit of a distinction to make there, and I can follow up on that one later if we would like. All right, so a couple things to wrap us out, wrap us up and round us out all in one there. A couple last minute things here. Clicking on the row menus, I find that this is a very interesting menu. It's very helpful and it has a lot of options, but it's often something people miss. Now, I was actually using it to insert rows, and to delete rows, of course. So that's probably where I would have talked about it in a normal training session. But if that's not something that comes up, or if you make those changes without mentioning it, try to be sure to come back to this detail, because it is important to make sure that users understand where to go to make these simple structural changes. They're simple, but they're efficient and they're necessary on almost every report. Column headers, the same. So let's walk through just some options here when you are in your training session. Make sure that you're teaching them how to insert columns, delete them, and adjust the widths and such. Now, the last piece, right? And that's that filter distinction that I want to talk about. Now, in the process of going over how to get back to the wizard menus, you will likely touch on this filter menu. As most of you probably already know, this filter menu is our database filter menu. These are applied right into the SQL, and if we're working with technical users that understand SQL and talking to a database, maybe you show them. I have done that many times, even taught sessions on what SQL is in order to be able to explain what these filters do. The other piece here, though, is that we have interactive filters. So if folks are asking questions that lead you to believe they want the report viewer interactive filters, things like often questions like, can I, once I've executed the report, make changes to the employee that I'm looking at, or filter the report to only see a certain date range? That's a very important cue for you as a trainer to talk about this interactive filter menu. Now, the biggest thing that you do want to make sure that they understand when you get to this menu is you can't go outside the bounds of any database filters that have been applied. Again, use verbiage that makes sense to them, whatever you've been using up until this point. But that's a good distinction to land on, and without going too deep, making sure that they understand the difference is important. All right. So one last question came up. Is there a way to drag and drop / move the columns? So in the Advanced Report Designer, that is not a capability that we do have. We can do that in Express View, and one of the reasons that we have separated functionality by creating the Express View Designer is to bring some of those requests to our users. So if dragging and dropping is a hard requirement, that is the designer we would recommend. Now, we of course understand that there might be other functionalities in the Advanced Designer that you need, so we'll do our best to work with you guys and find a happy medium there. And one more comment from my favorite trainer, prompt filters is good too. Prompting filters are something that we should always talk about. If you go into the database filters versus the interactive filter menu, right, always talk about the prompting filters as well. Thanks so much for that tip. I totally forgot to mention that. All right. So I don't know about you guys, but I had a great time today. This has been one of the most fun labs I've had in a while. So thanks so much for all the interactivity. I always appreciate feedback, live or afterwards. Always looking for more feedback. Like I mentioned before, you guys inspired this mini series. Please let us know what else you'd like to see. Thank you so much. Your attendance really keeps us going here. Just to reiterate, I don't recall if we mentioned this last time, but we are skipping the technical labs for November and December. Attendance always gets a little finicky around the holidays, and we totally understand. So we would rather deliver labs when everybody is in the office and can attend live. Live is better because you can talk to us. So please tune in on December 11th. We are doing our last in the Train the Trainer series. Dashboards will be the topic. So come on back for that one, and we'll speak to you soon. Thanks, guys, so much.